All right, well, I got 3 o'clock. If there are no objections, I'll go ahead and get this started.
Yep, go ahead. Thanks, Jeff.
All right, well, everybody, welcome to my class. It's going to be about heat stress and the environmental factors that go into heat stress injuries. And we'll go ahead and get started with the not so fun facts about this. There we go. Construction workers are 6% of the total workforce, but account for 36% of all the heat-related deaths from 1992 to 2016, with a total of 285. So, whenever we look at this and think about how important it is to inform our workers and keep everyone safe and know what we're talking about, I mean that's a pretty big chunk of all of the heat-related deaths in all of the workforce in the U.S. It sounds like this is a little dated, but if you look at the dates that they've gone to, that's the earliest or the latest information that I could find on that. Now, if the individuals are at risk, everyone on the job site is, whether you're working inside or outside. Obviously, the the more strenuous the work, the higher the risk, and other things such as PPE, wearing respirators, suits, that also puts you at a higher risk for heat injuries and heat related sicknesses. Some of the contributing factors or the environmental factors: temperature, humidity, radiant heat, air velocity. It's not just how hot it is. There's several things that come into play. You know, biggest one is you know humidity, radiant heat, and if you've got any shade, and if there's no wind blowing, then all that sweat that you're putting out really doesn't do too much for you. Big takeaway is that temperature is not the only indicator. Your personal factors come into play: age, weight, fitness. A lot of what you do is, uh, your diet plays a lot into this as well. You know, if you're not eating right, not drinking enough water, getting enough electrolytes, and you just don't have that good healthy diet, that's really going to play into it. You know, these are all important things to think of. Not saying that the uh, the younger, more in shape workers are immune to this. It's just things that you have to watch out for. And obviously, uh, personnel that are acclimatized are a little bit less at risk. Whenever we talk about acclimatization, that usually takes 1 to 2 weeks for your body to get used to that temperature, that work that you're doing. You know, a lot of the times, whenever we have ongoing jobs with local contractors, we don't have to worry too much about this. But whenever we're pulling in workers from different areas, it's definitely something that we need to keep an eye out on. And later on in the slideshow, uh, we'll get down to a couple of things that this plays into. You know, Now we get to how your body reacts to the heat. You know, your blood circulation, it increases. It wants to go to the skin uh, to help you cool off, to really shed that heat through your skin. You know, like it says in there, it's like that's why your face turns red whenever you get hot. But just like everything else, once you start getting into physical labor, your muscles, your lungs, everything's going to want more blood flow going to that. So you get less blood flow to your skin and whatnot, and this hinders you from releasing that heat from your body. You know, the big thing is whether it's heat or cold or whatever, your body wants to be at its optimal temperature, and it tries to do everything it can to get there. But whenever you start putting a lot of stress on your body through work, and it it really just tends to pull all that to the muscles and stop you from getting to your optimum temperature. Everybody knows it. What do you do once you really start getting into work? You start sweating. It's your body's way of trying to cool you off. And the most effective way that it does that is by staying up there until it evaporates naturally. Nobody likes to be sweaty. Nobody likes all that. So you try to, dry yourselves off, wipe it off, get it off of you. It's most effective whenever you've got a little bit of sweat on you. You get that nice cool breeze going on. It helps cool you off a little bit better than not having that sweat and trying to just do it, an unnatural way. And I looked up and saw a fun fact. It says that, young males can sweat as much as 1 quart of sweat per hour. It's kind of gross, but that just shows you, how much, water you need to replace whenever we're working in these hot environments. Now we're getting into the actual heat disorders and heat injuries, you know, and whenever we look at them, we kind of put them in order. You got your heat rash, heat cramps, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. You start off with your uh, you know, least critical all the way down to, it becomes an actual medical emergency whenever you get down to the heat stroke of it all. Now, heat rash, it's also known as prickly heat. You know, that comes whenever your body's trying to sweat and it can't. It's because of blocked pores. That's due to poor hygiene, dirty clothes, ill-fitting clothes, tight clothes, stuff like that. Your body's trying to sweat, but it doesn't allow that, and it just turns into this really itchy, uncomfortable rash. You know, Once again, it's the least serious of them all, but each one of these builds on each other and are things to watch out for. You start seeing people with heat rash, they complain of prickly heat. It's like, okay, time to start watching people because all of these just start falling like dominoes. And, if we're not watching out, it can just get out of hand really quickly. You know, these are some uncomfortable conversations you might have to have with your crew, because you don't want to just sit there and call them dirty. But, sometimes we're out there and they're doing that dirty work. They need to make sure they're taking care of themselves. So, if they come to you complaining about that, just pull them off to the side and give them a few little nuggets of knowledge to pass on, about personal hygiene, keeping your clothes clean and fresh, and wearing looser fitting clothes, and that should help them clear up that. Heat cramps, they happen in the arms, legs, and abdomen. That's where they mostly occur, and they occur when you're sweating profusely and you drink large quantities of water really fast, and you're not really replacing those salts and those electrolytes in your body. Once again, they're pretty painful. Nobody likes a cramp. You know, it's another one of those conversations that you have to have. Like, hey, maybe you come sit down here, drink this electrolyte pack. Are you getting enough salt in your diet? Sit back. Always watch your people. As soon as they come up and they're complaining of any kind of symptoms that could be considered, heat injuries, we never take our eyes off of, make sure they're never alone. You always want to make sure you're watching them because once again, these things start falling, one after the other, and it can get out of hand, depending on that person's fitness level and how they're reacting. Now we're getting into heat exhaustion. This is where we go from oh, this is irritating, or oh, I'm getting cramps and this is uncomfortable, to you know these are starting to become medical emergencies. Whenever whenever we start getting into the heat exhaustion, it is a mild form of shock, you know, and it's your body's first real warning sign that something's seriously going on, because it just can't give off all this excessive heat that it's building up, through all the physical activities and what you're doing. Your body's trying hard, and it's just starting to fail. Even though it says that it's not an immediate threat to life, if properly treated, I mean it very quickly could go into the heat stroke area. Symptoms. Here's where you start really paying attention. You get that skin is clammy and moist. It's not to the danger zone quite yet as far as medical emergency. If they're still sweating, they're going to be extremely weak, fatigued, nauseous, headaches. They're going to be disorientated. They're going to be, pale or flushed. They're just not going to look right, you know. And at this point, your body temperature is usually slightly elevated. It can still show normal, but that's whenever we start. That's why it's the tipping point right there. Is that if you go by body temperature, it can appear normal, but just fall off a cliff really fast with this. Now your treatment, I've mentioned it a little bit earlier, is we don't leave that person alone. We move them into a cool resting place, and that can be under a tree, inside of a vehicle that's got the AC running, inside of a building that has AC. It's kind of one of those things, you use what you have. If you have a cooling tent already set up where you've got your cool water, maybe a fan, you want to get that person out of that direct sunlight as soon as possible and start giving them fluids and electrolytes. It's important that whenever we're giving anyone water or electrolyte fluids to drink, that we're not having them chug this. You want to make sure they're sipping and drinking it nice and easy. You know, Sometimes you have to stop them from that, because they're going to be disoriented. They're going to want to do things. You've got to take charge of that situation, control it, and make sure they're drinking it nice and evenly. And like I said, it's a mild form of shock. Now, somebody in any kind of medical emergency can go into shock for whatever reason. You know, it all depends on that person's mentality. Sometimes it's their threshold for pain. And that plays a big deal into why you always need to remain calm during any type of medical emergency. Because if you're freaking out, if you're, like go, 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 hurry, 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 they're going to see that and feed off of that, because they're already in really a weird headspace, disorientated, and they're going to think, oh my goodness, everything's going bad. And like I said, once they start getting that in their head, shock can set in really quickly. So always, remain professional and make sure you're staying calm and controlling that situation. And once again, if they're unconscious, fail to recover rapidly, or other injuries or history of medical problems, we're seeking medical attention immediately. That's one of those things. It's going to be in your court to make that call, you know, especially if they go unconscious or they have a medical history, say they have heart problems or, you know, diabetes or whatnot, you know, you don't have time to sit back and call 3 or 4 people and ask what to do. So once again, you take control of your situation, react appropriately, and you call for medical attention first, and then let the medics tell you that it was or was not the right call. But in my opinion, if you fear for somebody's well-being and health and life, making that call is never the wrong decision. Now we're getting into heat stroke, which is the most severe, and it can be fatal. You know, that's whenever your body you stop sweating. That's the big thing between you know heat stroke and the last one was you stop sweating. In the heat exhaustion, you're still clammy, you're still sweating, your body's still trying, you know, to drop its temperature. Once the sweating stops, that's whenever it becomes a true medical emergency. It's one of those things, and you know, once your body temp, gets too high, it it can have serious lifelong effects on you. You know, even if you fully recover, you'll be more prone to heat injuries later on in life, and they just keep stacking and compiling. So that's why it's important that we make sure we don't let it go from heat exhaustion to heat stroke. You know, because that's lifelong injuries that person's going to have to deal with. Some of the symptoms, like I said, they stop sweating, their pulse becomes rapid, they'll have severe mental confusion. You know, because once again, it's a form of your body going into shock and shutting down. You can have the potential for loss of consciousness and convulsions, and that body temp can get up to over 105. And like I said, once your body temp gets that high, then you're just more susceptible to heat injuries in the future. Hot, dry skin, you've got nothing left in the tank to burn. Your body has stopped trying to cool itself off naturally. And, you can die if untreated. It's one of those things. This is a true medical emergency. The treatment, you call 911 immediately. Immediately remove the victim to a cool area. Soak the clothing with cool water, not dumping ice on them. You can have ice packs that you put armpits, back of the neck, in the growing area. Trying to slowly cool that down, but it needs to be controlled. And then you always try to monitor those vital signs. Because even though you call 911, you've got to explain to the paramedics once they show up on site what's going on. Once again, it's very, very important that you control your site. Once there's a medical emergency and you're taking control, you're telling people what to do. Like, hey, clear a path. There's going to be an ambulance coming. You get me cool water. You clear this out. Hey, stop all other work. Stuff like that. You are taking control of that whole situation. We got prevention methods, like we talked about earlier in the slides. Big thing is acclimatization. You know, Once again, if you're using workers that are local, it's really not too big of a deal. But once again, if we're calling upon people from different parts of the country, sometimes even different parts of the states that you're working in, they might be up in the mountains and not used to that, swampy coastal area. So make sure that everybody's got a good chance to acclimatize. And that doesn't mean that they can't work. It just means that you have to recognize who is and who isn't, and make sure you watch them and that their foreman watch them very closely for 1 to 2 weeks until their bodies get used to what they're working in. Always work at least in pairs. No one should be out there alone and unafraid, you know, doing anything. Does it mean they have to be in their hip pocket? No, but it's like, hey, me and you are working, you and you are working, and we just watch out for each other. Next is drinking plenty of cool water and electrolytes. Now, it doesn't have to be ice cold water. It doesn't have to be room temperature water, just nice cool water, you know. And it's suggested that you drink one small cup every 15 to 20 minutes. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be on a clock, just drinking water and, making sure you get that every time. But, that's the goal to shoot for, is sitting there sipping on your water as you work, because it is way easier to keep yourself hydrated than to rehydrate yourself. If you're already starting off dehydrated and thirsty, dry mouthed and sweating, you're already behind the power curve on this one. So it's important to make sure that you remind your workers that, hey, these are the temperatures today, tomorrow, and in the next couple of days. Make sure you're drinking water after work too. We always have to push that hydration. We say it quite a bit, and I'm sure people get tired of hearing us say, you need to stay hydrated, hydrate. But once again, it's easier to stay hydrated than it is to rehydrate yourself. The next one is what we're doing right now. It's going through signs and symptoms of heat illnesses and taking appropriate actions. That's a big step right there, is making sure that we all know and that we pass on this information, to our fellow workers and managers, just to make sure that everybody knows what's going on. Because you as safety operators, safety officers, we can't be everywhere at once. So we rely on our team to help us out. So make sure our team knows about that as well. And this last one, scheduling. Schedule your most strenuous work during the coolest times of the day. We've had to do that out at Camp Lejeune, especially at this little place called Camp Devil Dog. I swear that place is right next to the sun and the swamp and everything. No wind gets out there. But I know Bob has talked about it earlier in some of our other meetings, that his roof work, they have to start way early in the morning just so they can get anything done, because those guys at MacDill are dealing with severe temperatures whenever it gets into the spring and summertime. So, that is the biggest thing. If we can, we adjust that schedule. More prevention methods. Spend as little time as possible in direct sunlight. Take frequent breaks in the cool. Wear loose, lightweight clothes. That is another one. Sometimes you get people that want to wear tight-fitting clothes, and it's kind of looking like it's restrictive. It's like, that's the last thing we want to do, is restrict any kind of blood flow to any part of our body. In these hot conditions. The next one, you're going to hear a lot of moans and groans from people if you if you tell them this too much, but really avoiding caffeine in excess, you know, caffeine can also, make the body lose water. So I'm sure everyone will love to hear that during your safety meetings in the morning is to avoid excessive amounts of caffeine. Some people live off of that stuff, but it's very important. And lastly, it's like you rotate your workers in and out of hot areas. We did that during the debris cleanup for LA. We started getting into those hotter months. You got them guys wearing the suits and respirators and whatnot. You know, we had a lot of great crews out there, and they wanted to keep going. So, it was talked about, and work rest ratios were mentioned, and then they started just rotating their own men and women in and out of their work areas. So all of these things, are real important. There's not just one answer to all of this. You really got to sit back and think outside of the box sometimes whenever it's talking about these prevention methods. Whoop. All right, now we're getting down to the heat measurement. The two main ways that we measure heat is through the heat index and the wet bulb. Now, if you look at this little slide I have up here, it just shows you what the wet bulb measures and what the heat index measures. Not saying that you have to go from one or the other or which one is the best. Obviously, I think the wet bulb is a more accurate way of getting the indication of what the actual temperature is outside. But if you cannot get the wet bulb information, heat index is just fine. Just know that you're going to be missing out on some of the factors that go into getting that wet bulb temperature, which I believe is a more accurate telling of the actual weather. Now, whenever you get to your sites, you can look up websites that, especially around military bases. Military bases tend to have their home pages, and they will usually post that wet bulb reading from the weather stations around the bases. Now, it doesn't mean that it's exclusive to military bases. Some places out in town will also have these weather stations that have the wet bulb temperatures. But if not, you can always just go off the heat index and stay vigilant. Now, this is a quick slide on what the wet bulb actually measures. 10% of it is the air temperature. It collects 70% of it is the simulated effect of sweating and the humidity in the air. And then the black bulb, that is for direct sunlight, like what it's supposed to feel. And through those three readings right there are tables that, if you have the old school one, it's a little slide rule that you move each one into position and it'll tell you the actual wet bulb temperature. Obviously, if you go into onto a website that's pulling data straight from a weather station, it's not really going to tell you what these all break down to. It's just going to give you the overall temperature. So I added this slide just to, let y'all see whenever we talk about what a wet bulb is, what goes into it. Now, the wet bulb is the wet bulb globe temperature index. It's a number that's calculated as a combination of humidity, radiant, and ambient temperature readings. Then you can take these numbers and combine them with the workload and stress to determine the heat stress potential on all workers. And the next couple of slides were pulled straight from ECC's safety SOPs on the work rest ratios. The first one right here, that is for unacclimatized workers. And you can just go ahead and look up the top. It talks about the cycles of work and recovery and what type of work is going on, like very heavy, moderate, and light work. Then you go down and you start looking at each temperature reading and what is the work rest ratio that you should be using. The next one's slightly different because it goes through acclimatized workers. So once again, it just goes over the work rest ratio, the percentage wise, versus the temperature and what type of activities you're doing. Here's some other factors that'll go into that you can add into the temperature once you get your wet bulb temperatures. You look over here and it talks about the clothing type. Down at the bottom, you see the limited use vapor barrier coveralls. Like you add that into it, and that's an immediate 11-degree, add on to the wet bulb temperature. So, if it's 80 on the wet bulb, it's like, oh, good night. Now we've added all of this. So that was something that we really had to watch out for out in Los Angeles. They actually changed the type of coveralls they used, which were the ones right above it, which only added 1 degree, to it. So, it should be common sense that the more PPE and the harder you work, the more factors add into what your body's actually feeling. But, sometimes you have to throw it out there and show people, like, hey, this is why we're reading this, and this is why the work rest ratio has to be like this, and that's whenever, thinking outside the box, really comes into play. Whether it's rotating people or keeping them just outside of a hot zone and the decontamination zone to where they don't have to wear any type of respirator or coveralls really comes into play. So like I said, there's no just black and white answer on anything. We got to use our heads out there. Now we have some other considerations. Now there's physiological monitoring for heat stress. Now that is also, you can look that up in ECC's safety SOPs. A lot goes into that. You'll need a thermometer, a pulse X reader, training, all of the paperwork and people to understand what is going on. We attempted this out in Los Angeles. We spent a lot of time collecting all of the gear that we would need, all of the paperwork, training the TFLs. A lot of work went into it. And then people were not very receptive to the physiological monitoring whenever it came to heat stress out there. It was a delicate situation, and that's why I continually say that we need to make sure that there's not just one answer out there, and you really do have to work as a team. Our job is to keep people safe so that the job can continue. So we really need to work with our partners and the workers to make sure that that the right type of mitigation is in place and monitoring. The physiological monitoring could probably take another half hour to explain. I'm sure if you call Nick Rude, he would love to talk about that to you at any point. Just joking, but if you have any questions, you can get with me and I can, talk to you about it. But like I said, it's also in the ECC SOPs for safety. And the last thing that I'm going to talk to you about is, with considerations is state regulations. Now, a lot of the times we're working on, you know, federal properties, military installations, and whatnot. So some of these state and local regulations don't come into play, but some states like California, Oregon, Michigan have very specific regulations that you have to follow, and that includes not just, water and access to shade. It's a whole nother set of papers that you need. You have to have an entire written plan for this stuff. And once again, it's not just for outside work either. A lot of us forget that interior work needs this as well, and I believe that's where Michigan's regulations come into play. There's a very specific amount of airflow that needs to go through these buildings, and temperatures, and you know and their own style of work rest ratios. So it's real important. Like if you roll up to a new project and you're getting things ready, do a little bit of research. We had to do it out there in the fires, and luckily, ECC's done quite a bit of work out in California in the past for the state. So those regulations were known, and they were already being implemented, well before we had to tell people to. So, that was a lucky thing, but we need to make sure that, especially even if it's a federal project and we're not on a federal installation, we need to abide by those state and local regulations as well. So always be mindful of that. And with that, that is all I have for this class. Do I have any questions?
Jeff, this is Sally. I just wanted to jump on real quick and let everybody know that I popped a link in the meeting chat. It'll get you to the attendance quiz and the course that's a recap of everything that Jeffrey's gone over. We will also have a recording of this session that's available as soon as it is downloaded and edited.
Well, thank you. Anybody got anything else for me?
So I see something else in the chat from Wendy, and it says also make sure you check your heat stress instruments and calibration requirements to make sure you're doing everything as recommended by the manufacturer. And that's something too, we need to make sure that we're documenting. If we have any instruments that have to be calibrated, make sure you're documenting that. Thanks, Wendy.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you.
Anybody else? Any questions? Okay. Great job, Jeff. Thank you very much for doing that. And if anybody thinks of anything or has any questions later, don't be afraid to reach out.